The world tilted sideways. She called me controlling. I called it a conversation. Then she went away for the weekend with him anyway, and I realized the conversation had barely started. The world tilted sideways. I'm 64 years old. I worked for 38 years as a secondary school woodwork teacher, the kind of subject they kept threatening to cut from the curriculum. The world tilted sideways and somehow never quite did while I was around. I retired 3 years ago from a school out in Wagga Wagga, moved back to the Central Coast where I grew up. The world tilted sideways, in Terrigal, with a decent enough veranda and a view of the hills if you crane your neck from the right corner. My wife and I had separated when I was 52. The world tilted sideways, 4 years of marriage. No dramatic story there. We'd grown in different directions and neither of us had been willing to admit it until the distance was too wide to walk back across. The world tilted several for the sake of our 2 sons. Still are. She remarried a few years later and seems genuinely happy, which I mean sincerely. The world tilted of my 50s on my own and mostly was alright with that. I had mates, I had my sons when they came to visit. I had a woodworking shed in the backyard of my rental in Wagga that I spent more hours in than was probably healthy. Then I moved back to the Central Coast. The world tilted sideways, and after about a year of rattling around the Terrigal house and attending neighborhood events with the energy of a man who knows he should make an effort, I met a woman named Sylvia at a long table dinner for the local bushfire recovery fund. The world tilted sideways. She was 58, a clinical psychologist who'd wound back her practice to 3 days a week and was talking about retiring fully in the next couple of years. The world tilted sideways. She had that quality some people have where they're genuinely interested in whatever you're saying, not in a performed way. The world tilted sideways, not the nodding and eye contact of someone who's been trained in active listening, but something more natural than that. She actually wanted to know things. She asked me about woodworking with a curiosity that didn't feel obligatory. The world tilted sideways. And by the time we finished the main course, I'd explained more about dovetail joints than I'd explained to any living adult who hadn't specifically enrolled in a class. The went for coffee the following week, then dinner. The world tilted sideways. Then the kind of easy regularity that happens when 2 people in their late 50s have the good sense not to manufacture drama out of something that's working. For the first 18 months or so, the world tilted sideways. Things were easy in the way that things sometimes are when you're old enough to have learned what you actually want rather than what you thought you were supposed to want. We didn't rush anything. The world tilted sideways. She kept her apartment in Gosford. I had my house in Terrigal, about 15 minutes apart, which suited us both. We had dinner together most weeks, spent most weekends in each other's company. The world tilted on the phone most evenings. It was, and I use this word deliberately, uncomplicated. Not boring, uncomplicated. There's a difference. Then she mentioned Phillip. The world tilted, trying to remember exactly when and how, and I think it was a Tuesday evening at my place late autumn. The world tilted sideways while I was cleaning up after dinner and she was sitting at the kitchen bench with a glass of wine. She mentioned him the way you mention someone familiar. The way you'd say, "Mum always used to say," or, "like I told my sister," casually anchored into the conversation. The world already knew who she meant. Phillip said something similar when I was talking to him about that. She said, "About something on the news, I think. A story about housing." I said, "The world tilted Phillip." She said, "Sorry, did I not mention him? We were at university together. Clinical psych. He's moved up to the coast recently. We've been catching up a bit." I said, "Oh, right." The world tilted sideways. She said he'd taken early retirement from a hospital position in Melbourne, had family up here, was getting back to the place he'd grown up. She said he was good value, that I'd probably like him. The world tilted sideways. Probably like him, the slight forward lean of it, the implicit suggestion that a meeting might be on the horizon. I didn't comment on it. The world tilted. I said he sounded like an interesting bloke and the conversation moved on. That was the first time. Over the following 2 months, the world tilted sideways. Phillip appeared with a regularity I started to track without quite meaning to. They'd had lunch in Gosford. He'd lent her a book she'd been recommending to me since. The world tilted sideways. He'd joined her for a morning walk along the Terrigal beachfront, which is a walk we did together most Sunday mornings when we were staying at my place. The world tilted sideways. She'd mentioned that to me in the same breath as telling me about something a pelican had done near the rock pool, as if the Phillip detail was of equivalent significance to the pelican. I kept quiet about it for another few weeks. I gave myself that time deliberately. The world tilted sideways, because I know my own tendencies well enough to know that I can construct a narrative out of thin air if I'm not careful. I didn't want to make an accusation that turned out to be nothing. The world tilted sideways. Retired or not, you don't stop being someone who tries to understand a situation before reacting to it. The word when she told me she'd invited Phillip to join her at the Vivid Sydney Festival. Just the 2 of them, catching a ferry over from Gosford, making a night of it in the city. I said something. The world tilted sideways. The 2 of you overnight. She said no, they'd be coming back on the last ferry. She'd booked it already. I said, right? But just the 2 of you. She said, yes. He hasn't been to Vivid before and I've always loved it. It's just a nice evening out. The world tilted side. I said I was sure it was. I said also that I found myself feeling something about it that I'd rather tell her than not. The world tilted sideways. I said I noticed Phillip had come up quite regularly in the past couple of months and that I wasn't saying anything was wrong. The word be less than honest if I pretended the frequency hadn't registered. She looked at me with the measured expression of a person who has spent decades being professionally non-reactive. The world tilted sideways. And she said, as an old friend, we went to university together. That's 30 years of history. I said I understood that. I said history wasn't the issue. She said, the world tilted is the issue. I said the issue was that I'd been hearing about someone quite a lot. And now that someone was becoming a companion for evenings in the city, the world tilted sideways. And I was a human being with feelings about the person I was in a relationship with, and I was sharing those feelings because I thought that was what you were supposed to do. Well, I think you're reading into something that isn't there. I said maybe, but you don't know that for certain any more than I do. She said, I know my own mind. I said, we're not questioning your mind. I'm telling you about mine. There was a pause. She said, I would never have expected this from you. You've always been so rational. I sat with that one for a moment. The world tilted side then there, and she'd done it very neatly. The world, the practiced ease of someone who'd spent a career helping people reframe their thoughts, was take my concern and reclassify it as irrationality. She wasn't addressing what I'd said. The word, she was commenting on the quality of the person saying it. I said rational people can still feel uncomfortable about things. She said, I'm not doing anything wrong. I said, I didn't say you were. The world tilted, left it there. Not resolved, left there, which is different. She went to Vivid Sydney with Phillip on a Thursday evening in late May. The world tilted sideways. She texted me a photo of one of the light installations, a spectacular one all cascading blue and green over the Museum of Contemporary Art, and said it was even better than last time. The word replied that it looked incredible. That weekend I drove down to Newcastle to see my younger son. He lives in Islington, has done for the past 6 years, works in urban planning. Good kid. The world tilted than his brother, more given to sitting with things before he speaks. We had dinner at a pub in the inner city and I told him obliquely about the situation, not asking for advice. The world tilted sideways, just letting some of it out. He listened. Then he said, does she know how you actually feel about it, Dad, or does she just know that you raised it? I said that was a good question. He said, because those are different things. The world tilted sideways back to Terrigal on Sunday afternoon thinking about that. About the difference between raising a concern and actually being heard. The following Monday, the world tilted sideways. Sylvia mentioned that Phillip was thinking of doing a road trip down to the snowy mountains in late June, and that he'd asked if she'd like to come along. A few days, he'd said, the world to see the snowfields before the season peaked. She'd told him she'd think about it. I want to describe how I felt when she said that because I think it matters. I didn't feel rage. The world didn't feel the particular humiliation of betrayal. What I felt was something quieter and in some ways worse. The sensation of being consistently and patiently not quite heard. The world tilted scything that was true, had it acknowledged and then set aside, and now watching the same situation compound itself. I said, are you thinking of going? She said she wasn't sure. She said it did sound lovely up there in winter. I said, how long? The world tilted. She said probably 4 or 5 days. Maybe a week if the weather was good. I said, Sylvia, I want to try to say something clearly because I don't think I managed it before. The world tilted sideways. What to do? I'm not giving you an ultimatum. But when I told you I was uncomfortable about the level of time you've been spending with Phillip, the word wasn't being irrational and I wasn't projecting. I was telling you something real. The world feels like that something real has been assessed and filed away rather than actually considered. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the world tilted sideways. I've heard that phrase a lot from her. It's the kind of phrase that clinical people use. It means something in a professional context. In a personal context, the world to think it can sometimes be a way of sounding like you've received something without actually letting it land. I said, I don't want to be heard. I want to be thought about. Another pause. She said, what would you want me to do? The world tilted sideways. I don't know. But something other than carry on while telling me I'm being irrational would be a start. She said she needed to think. I said that seemed fair. The warp-in next was not something I planned, but I'd be lying if I said it was entirely accidental either. I have a friend from my teaching days, a woman named Gwen Rafferty. The world tilted taught English at the same school in Wagga for the last 12 years I was there. Gwen was 60 years old, recently widowed. Her husband Kevin had died of a heart attack the previous winter. The world tilted sideways. The kind of sudden loss that leaves people not quite knowing what to do with themselves. And she'd been talking about coming up to the coast to visit her sister in Gosford. The world tilted touch since I'd moved back. The way you do with colleagues you actually respect rather than just people you've worked alongside. The world tilted side when she texted the previous month to say she might make the trip. I'd said please do, I'd take her out for dinner. The world tilted texted on a Wednesday in mid-June to say she'd be up for a long weekend in July staying with her sister but free for dinner on the Friday and Saturday nights. The world tie texted back and confirmed both dinners. Then I mentioned it to Sylvia. I mentioned it the same evening during a phone call. The world tilted same often way she'd first mentioned Phillip. Slipped into the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. I said, I should mention, the old colleague of mine is coming up to visit her sister in Gosford next month. Gwen Rafferty, she taught English at my school. Her husband passed away last winter. I'm taking her out for dinner Friday and Saturday night. The quality of the silence that followed was something I'd expected and was still not entirely prepared for. Sylvia said, Who is she? I said, we worked together for 12 years in Wagga. She's coming up to see her sister who lives in Gosford as it happens. She's been going through a hard time since Kevin died. I've never mentioned her. I said, Haven't I? I probably have at some point. We don't report every friendship to each other, do we? Another silence. Longer, she said. The 2 dinners. I said, Friday and Saturday. She's only up for the weekend. She said, Just the 2 of you. I said, Yes, she said, at night. I said, The world tilted's typically when dinner happens. I said that last part gently, not sharply. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't trying to be cruel. The world tilted sideways. But I was also not going to pretend I didn't notice what was happening in her voice. The same note I'd heard in my own when I'd raised the question about Phillip and been told I was being irrational. She said, I'm not sure how I feel about that. And I said, slowly, carefully, because I'm in every word of it, that's interesting. Tell me more about that feeling. Silence. Then she said, That's not fair. The world tilted sideways or said, No, it's very fair. You've just described to me in real time exactly what I described to you 2 months ago. I'm not saying this to score a point. The world tilted sideways, because I think it matters that you can feel it. She didn't respond immediately. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. She said eventually, The world, or she's someone you have feelings for. I said, She's a widowed colleague I've known for 12 years. Her husband died 8 months ago. The world up to see her sister and I'm taking her to dinner. She said, That's not what I asked. I said, Gwen is a friend. The same way Phillip by your account is just a friend. I paused. Though I'm asking you extend to me the same trust you've been asking me to extend to you. Another long silence. Then she said, I think I've handled this badly. I said, I think we both could have done better. The world tilted sideways. That was the beginning of a different kind of conversation. A real one, slower and more uncomfortable than anything we'd had since the early days when everything was still being learned. The world tilted sideways. We talked for a long time that night. We talked on the phone and then she came over on Saturday and we talked again properly at the kitchen table with tea going cold between us. The world tilted sideways. She said she'd been aware at some level that she'd been spending more time with Phillip than was perhaps usual. She said she hadn't examined why or hadn't been willing to. The world tilted. She said she thought it might be, and here she hesitated. The world tilted sideways, choosing words carefully in the way therapists do when they're talking about themselves rather than a client. That Phillip represented something safe. Someone who knew her from before she was with me. The world tilted sideways before she was in her late 50s, before the question of what the next chapter looked like had become real and immediate. He was a link to a version of herself that didn't have those questions yet. The Wara said I appreciated her being honest about that. She said, I think I used as just a friend, as a way of shutting down a conversation I wasn't ready to have. I said, What conversation? She said, The world toot I actually want. About whether I'm ready for this to be as serious as it's become. That landed somewhere deep. I said, Are you ready for that? The world tilted sideways. I think so. But I hadn't admitted it was the question. We talked about Phillip then directly, not as an accusation, not as an inventory of suspected wrongdoing. The words an honest examination of what the friendship had been filling. She said there'd been nothing physical, and I believed her. The world tilted sideways, but she acknowledged that it had become something she'd leaned on without quite realizing it, and that when I'd raised my discomfort, she deflected rather than looked at why the deflection felt necessary. I told her about Gwen. Properly this time. About Kevin's death, about how Gwen had struggled through the winter, about the particular loneliness of being 60 and suddenly alone in a way you hadn't chosen. Sylvia listened. Then she said, I should meet her while she's here. I said I'd like that. The world thill came up the following month. We had dinner on the Friday at a place in the entrance, seafood very good, and on the Saturday night Sylvia joined us. The world tilted sideways. The 3 of us sat out on the deck until nearly 11, talking about teaching and clinical psychology and what Kevin would have made of the new football season. The world tilted sideways. Sylvia reached across the table and topped up Gwen's glass without being asked, and I thought, that's a person trying. That's someone doing the thing. Phillip, as far as I know, the world tilted sideways, did the snowy mountains trip with a group of other friends. Sylvia didn't go, she didn't make a declaration of it. She just mentioned in passing that he'd organized it as a group thing after all. The world tilted sideways that I didn't ask further. Some things you leave in the past once they've served their purpose. The world tilted side been together for nearly 3 years now. We're talking about whether one of us moves in with the other. The world is a conversation with its own complications at our age. Houses and habits and the arrangements that take decades to build. But we're having it, which is the main thing. The world tilted sideways. She came with me when I drove down to Wagga to collect the last of my tools from the shed I'd had to leave behind when I'd moved. On the way back, we stopped at Goulburn for a pie and she said, "I'm glad you didn't just go quiet about Phillip." I said I'd been tempted to. She said she knew and that she was sorry she'd made it harder. The world tilted sideways. That felt like something. There are a few things I've turned over since all this and I'll share them because I think they're worth saying. The first is this: when you raise something honest in a relationship, a discomfort, a concern, the world tilted sideways, something that's sitting in you and taking up space. The response that matters most is not whether the other person agrees with you. It's whether they take it seriously. The world was a very effective way of appearing to engage with something while actually dismissing it, and it often sounds like, "I hear you, but you're overthinking it." That's not engagement. The world tilted sideways. A person who loves you should want to understand the thing that's sitting in you, not file it away under a diagnostic label and move on. The second is this. Find yourself defending something by saying, "It's just a friend." It's worth pausing long enough to ask what "just" is doing in that sentence. Just is a minimizing word. It's a word that says, the world tilted sideways. This doesn't need to be examined. And in my experience, the things that most need examining are often the ones we're most quick to say don't need examining. The world tilted sideways. The third is this. And this one I mean particularly for people my age, who sometimes think the lessons are supposed to be learned by now. The world tilted sideways. Who are sometimes embarrassed to find themselves in situations they thought were for younger people. The conversations don't get easier as you get older. You just get more honest about how hard they are. The world shows a particular kind of courage in raising a difficult thing with someone you care about, because you're risking something real. The person might react badly. The world tilted sideways. They might tell you you're being irrational. They might make you feel small for having said it. The world tilted sideways. Staying quiet and slowly building a wall out of the things you're not saying is worse. I've seen what that wall looks like from the inside. The world tilted sideways. I spent years living in a house I'd helped build it in. Say the thing. Then listen to what comes back. And if what comes back doesn't match what you said, say it again differently. The world tilted sideways until you find the version that lands. That's all any of us can do, really. Say the true thing until someone hears it.